United Nations in Africa. Communist-directed terrorists in African Angola have committed indescribable atrocities. Whole villages are destroyed, the women raped and tortured, men and children mutilated, and then all chopped up in small pieces in cannibalistic rites. The operation was organized and directed by Holden Roberto, who received his modern weapons from United Nations troops, who enjoys support from American liberals, and who has traveled abroad in United Nations planes and visited the United States since he initiated the savagery. The United States has stood with the Soviet Union in the United Nations to condemn Portugal for striking back in an effort to protect her people. We could stop the United Nations' horrible program of supporting communist-directed mass murder in Africa if we would get out of the UN and refuse to pay its bills. Legislation calling for such action is now pending. That is a summary of my report on United Nations in Africa. The full report after a message from my sponsor. The communist campaign of race hatred in Africa, which began in the late 1950s, involves relatively few actual communists, but it has been supported by the United Nations and by the United States. It is easy to understand the UN support because, since the 1950s, the UN has been controlled by the Afro-Asian and communist blocs. American motives, however, are hard to define. In an effort to show that the United States is not anti-colored and that it is opposed to colonialism, our liberal political leaders have followed a senseless policy of supporting any colored agitator who announces himself a leader for national independence in Africa, despite the horrible consequences for the mass of Africans themselves. Much of the European colonialism, which our State Department joins the communists in condemning intemperately, has done a great deal of good for Africa. European colonialism eliminated the age-old practice of slavery in Africa, and slavery is returning as Europeans withdraw. European colonialism opened Africa to Christian missionary work. European colonialism brought the first and only light of civilization to most of dark Africa, and it was preparing African populations with all the speed humanly possible for genuine independence as orderly nations of civilized people. On the other hand, Soviet colonialism in Asia has been characterized by mass murder, planned elimination of whole races, ethnic groups, and economic classes. It is, to say the least, strange that our liberal policymakers who violently condemn the relatively benign European colonialism never say a word about barbaric Soviet colonialism. In 1954, the Soviets sent Daniel Solod as ambassador to Egypt to establish the Soviet embassy in Cairo as the center for communist agitation in North Africa. At about the same time, Holden Roberto was sent to Leopoldville in the then Belgian Congo to set up a communist front with a mission to create unrest in the African territories of Portugal. Just a few months prior to these events, the American Committee on Africa was set up in New York City. This committee is an interlocking affiliate of the Council on Foreign Relations, the controlling center of a network of tax-exempt organizations which I call the Invisible Government. Fundraising letters of the committee reflect the exact Soviet line with regard to racial uprisings in Africa. And Holden Roberto, the communist who directed mass murders and indescribable atrocities in Portuguese Angola, openly boasts support from the American Committee on Africa. In October 1960, Roberto organized a band of terrorist guerrillas and put them in a training camp in the Congo about 60 miles from the Angola border. Roberto called his terrorists an army of liberation. Their mission was to invade Angola and exterminate all Europeans. On December 3rd, 1960, Roberto alerted his army with this message, quote, "Long live Nikita Khrushchev. Long live Angola. Prepare your arms, we are about to open fire. We have no fear. Russia will provide weapons and Lumumba will help us. Let us kill the whites," end quote. On March 10, 1961, Roberto ordered a general strike in northern Angola. To begin on March 15, he moved his army of terrorists to the Congolese border and scattered it along a 400-mile front in position to invade Angola on March 15. The strike and invasion were timed to coincide with action by the United Nations Security Council in New York City, which had scheduled for March 15 a vote on a resolution criticizing Portugal for her policy in Angola. All went according to the communist plan. The general strike hit Portuguese Angola on March 15. That night, the UN Security Council in New York voted on the resolution. The United States joined the USSR in supporting the resolution, which failed, however, to carry. Simultaneously with this United Nations action, Roberto sent his terrorists across the frontier into Angola, where they raped and pillaged Africans and Portuguese, commenting on the Reign of Terror, which began March 15, 1961. American Brigadier General Frank L. Halley, after this picture of primitive, hideous terror, a picture replete with grotesque episodes of body chopping, ritual cannibalism, and tribal hatred by men often under the excitement of drugs or incited by witch doctors. The savagery then unleashed is still raging today. Though its primary targets are whites and mulattoes, the vast majority of the murdered and maimed have been black Africans. Abroad and in the United Nations, the bloodletting has been portrayed as a nationalist uprising by men who merely want independence from Portugal. It is nothing of the sort. Explosion of tribalism and cannibalism among people who have no inkling of what independence, nationhood, and the other concepts advanced in their name, end quote. General Halley told of seeing a 9-year-old colored girl in a hospital at Dock. The child had been forced to join in eating the flesh of her murdered mother on the day that Roberto's terrorists struck her village. He told of a 28-year-old white man who heard his wife scream in the kitchen early one morning. Rushing to her aid, the husband found her already dead, with black savages chopping off her arms and legs and head. The general told about the little village of Damba, where villagers, mostly black but a few whites and mixed bloods, fled to a Catholic church for protection when Roberto's savages arrived. Carrying a crucifix, the priest went outside, speaking kindly to the attackers, trying to calm them. The savages cut him down and chopped his body into small pieces so that even God couldn't put him together again, as they said, and then broke into the church to slaughter every man, woman, and child. Eyewitnesses in Angola told General Halley how the raids, still going on, are generally organized. In a typical operation, a few heavily armed bandits, accompanied by witch doctors, burst into a village far back in the bush and line up all villagers at gunpoint. They demand that the village men accompany them on raids of white towns and plantations, promising the men women to rape and rich loot. If such promises do not bring enough recruits, the witch doctors go to work, casting spells, administering drugs, promising eternal life for the spirits of all who go on the raids. If this fails, the bandits shoot a few men, women, and children to intimidate the rest into submission and participation. Roberto's savages slaughtered about 200 Europeans and 300 innocent Africans on that first day of their invasion of Angola. In the report on which this broadcast is based, I relate a few actual incidents. They are too horrible, too revolting to broadcast. These are the liberation activities in Portuguese Angola, which were planned by communist intellectuals from all over the world at a conference in Ghana in 1958, which have been upheld by the United Nations as a nationalist uprising, and which Adlai Stevenson has spoken of sympathetically as the actions of idealistic rebels seeking independence for their country. Portuguese authorities, of course, reacted with maximum force to protect their people from the bestiality. Communist and African delegates in the United Nations accused Portugal of brutality, and the United States joined the Soviet Union in supporting a UN Security Council resolution calling upon Portugal to stop her repressive measures in Angola. Holden Roberto had promised his terrorists that Russia would supply the weapons for their invasion of Angola, but he was wrong. On the first day of the invasion, his terrorists were equipped largely with spears, clubs, homemade knives, and old hunting guns. What modern weapons they did have came not from Russia, but from United Nations troops in the Congo and from Congolese army troops. The UN in the Congo and the Congolese army are financed largely by the United States. This means that you and I, American taxpayers, helped finance the communist-directed bestiality in Portuguese Angola. Since March 15, 1961, the Soviets have established supply lines running through communist-controlled Ghana, and Roberto's terrorists have been equipped with modern automatic weapons made in Czechoslovakia. Roberto has had leisure to leave Africa in planes made available to him by UN forces in the Congo for visits to Belgrade, London, and the United States. Our State Department, which approved the visit of this communist mass murderer, would not permit a visit by Chombe, Christian anti-communist president of Katanga. Portuguese territories are the key to control of all of Central and South Africa not already in the hands of bandits and communists. If they go, 3 million whites in the Republic of South Africa, the last remaining outpost of civilization and the richest looting prize of all, will be cut off and surrounded by communist-dominated territories where millions of blacks will be under constant incitement to lust and savage hate. The United States, of course, has no business supporting a war in Africa for Portugal or any other colonial power. But neither do we have any business financing the present communist United Nations operations against Portugal as we are doing. We should, however, give moral and diplomatic support to the Portuguese in their efforts to defend their people and their territories. We cannot change United Nations policies. As long as we stay in the UN, we will be supporting bestiality in Africa. UN operations would collapse without our support, and communists could not finance their African operations as well as they're now being financed with our money through the United Nations. It follows that we could best help ourselves by getting out of the UN and refusing to pay its bills. Legislation introduced by Representatives Utt and Bruce Alger calling for such action is now pending, and it deserves public support. Goodbye. God bless you. For a printed copy of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot,